So today I'd like to share with you some reflections that I have on some words from the Genjokoan, is what has been alive for me recently. And kind of looking at where we're at now with Sesshin, just looking at these last 3 days, we can look at it as we've made it through Saturday and made it through Sunday and made it through Monday, and now we're into Tuesday, and we've had experiences and things have happened, and we may have a story around that, and it might be feeding a story about what's going to come in the next few days. It's actually very unlikely that you don't have something like that operating at some level about the past and the future. We could also look at it as, over the course of time, phenomena have come forth, continue to come forth moment by moment by moment, and just made themselves available to your consciousness. So there's no plot, there's no story, there's just moment by moment appreciation of phenomena. And this is the point of these lines from Genjokoan that I want to share. Dogen Zenji says, "To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening." These lines have been very powerful for me in the last year and a half of my life. I've just come to find them very activated and very helpful for me, and I'd just like to share and appreciate them with you in the talk today, in the hopes that they may help you as well. I was called to look deeper into Genjokoan about 5 years ago. A lot of the teachings from Genjokoan, although it's not a long fascicle of the Shobogenzo, it's very concentrated and contains a lot of perspectives and deep teachings from Dogen Zenji. And we all in this lineage, and in many, certainly Soto lineages and other Zen lineages, find great concentrated value in this fascicle. So I picked up a lot of it and worked with it to a certain extent over the years of my study with Sesshin Roshi. But about 5 years ago, I took over the Naropa Zen class from Sesshin Roshi, and he had in his curriculum a whole class on Genjokoan. And I realized coming up to the date when I was going to teach that class that I better jump in and understand it better than I felt that I did. So I jumped in, and sure enough, there were parts that were very opaque to me. And I applied myself to it, and I really wanted to understand what Dogen was talking about, what he was sharing in this teaching. You know, probably partly because I was afraid that a student was going to ask me a question and I'd look like an idiot. But also because I knew it was, deep. So I did, and going through it, at some point something clicked, something crystallized for me with it, and the whole thing just kind of opened up for me in an amazing way, and it's really helped me in my life ever since then. And just in the last few years, it's these two lines that I keep kind of coming back to as almost a guidepost for my practice in a moment-to-moment, day-to-day kind of way. These lines actually are the fourth lines of the entire Genjokoan. They're immediately followed by to study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the myriad things. It's the quote that is most popular, most commonly recognized from the Genjokoan. And these lines just precede that, where Dogen Zenji puts out his understanding of what delusion and realization is. To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. that myriad things come forth and experience themselves in you is awakening. So right off I want to say that here's an understanding of delusion and realization not as states, not as conditions, but as a particular relationship between the self and myriad things. I also want to be clear right up front here that this isn't speculative philosophy at all. It can sometimes sound that way, but it's definitely not. It's comes from clear view in my mind. This is an aid to right view. It's not speculation with concepts. It's actually helping to point us to right view, which is one of the Eightfold Path. It's right view. We have to see clearly in order to operate clearly, and in order to have right mindfulness, right concentration, and even right livelihood, right effort, right speech. We have to have right view. And I think this really helps with right view. And I do think it's also helpful for practice. And I'll share some of the ways that these teachings have been helpful to me. So I want to look first at these 5 terms that are packed into this couplet from the Genjokoan. There's delusion and realization, right? And then there's self, myriad things, and then there's experience. Kind of the 5 main components of this investigation. So real briefly, delusion can be understood in different ways, and Dogen is presenting his understanding of it right here. In Buddhist understanding, and I'm sure in your experience, you know that delusion leads to suffering. That's a core. It's a core tenet of the Buddhist teaching, and I'm sure it's a core aspect of your experience and your practice. I know in my own experience, my life, delusion is what brought me to this practice. It was the suffering that I was experiencing because of confusion about what was going on in my life. I came to Zen practice strongly in my middle to late 20s. I had read the menu before that, studied intellectually some of the Buddhist concepts, but it wasn't until I hit this point in my life where I became very confused and very decentered and very depressed, and I was almost suicidal with the darkness that I was experiencing, the conflict within myself that I just could not resolve. There was some view within myself, some realization, a recognition within myself that I was creating the suffering myself. I just glimpsed that it wasn't due to external conditions, it wasn't due to what that person did to me or what I wasn't able to accomplish in this area, that it had something to do with a false view I had about myself. I just had a glimpse of that. So the Buddhist teachings that I had been reading on delusion leading to suffering as the core factor leading to suffering resonated with me, and that's what motivated me to practice. So for me, understanding delusion, how is this coming about? How am I creating the suffering within myself? It was a very high stakes question. I really needed to understand. I needed to see this, and I needed to untie the knots I had tied myself into. Dogen's understanding here is a bit uncommon, even relative to traditional Buddhist understanding. Because Buddhist understanding has a little bit... and I may be generalizing. I'm generalizing here. The traditional Buddhist understanding is delusion. Delusion leads to suffering, and if we eradicate delusion, we get to enlightenment, and we get to freedom. So we have that kind of process going on. Let's clean up the delusion. Let's clarify. Let's do that. And Dogen's understanding, you can kind of see right from the beginning, and I'll talk more about it, isn't like that at all. It just really has to do with this relation between self and myriad things. And since self and myriad things are also the constituents of realization, we're never going to eradicate delusion. The realization is the next term, and I'm not going to say anything about that. So the next one is self, which is Jiko in Japanese. And we're all familiar with this self, right? It's the me story that we have. Talked about it in the beginning. We have a me story about our life. We have a me story about our week. We have a me story about our day. We even have a me story about, the last 5 minutes and the next 5 minutes. We've got a lot of me stories, all kind of laced together in this web, built up into this thing that we call ourselves. The self in Dogen's understanding is it's not deluded in itself. The delusion comes in because of its tendency to see itself as the subject of experience. But the self is the self. We could call it a provisional self. Katagiri Roshi calls it. We have a provisional self, or really we have provisional selves operating at different levels, and also with different degrees of usefulness. They do have some use. They even may conform to reality in certain ways. If we also open up to understanding the developmental aspects of our own being that modern Buddhist practices and teachings, such as Rishis and Roshis in the Great Heart Way, are looking at, there's aspects of the self that we want to really nurture healthfully. Healthy attachments. That's one word for them, healthy attachments. I don't know if that's a great word. Healthy bonds, healthy relationships. I like to remind myself of this saying from the spiritual psychologist John Wellwood, who said we are simultaneously humans waking up as Buddhas and Buddhas growing up as humans. So this process of growing up is a process of growth, associated with our self-understanding, capabilities, body, etc. Myriad things. The Japanese word is banpo. Ban is numberless or 10,000 or myriad, and po means things or beings. And my word processor kept auto-correcting banpo to banjo. Thought that kind of worked, maybe. But these myriad things are both internal and external. Okay, so they're phenomena that come to us through sense consciousness, right, through the 6 senses, externally and then also internally. And the self is also a banpo. The self is one of the myriad things. Okay. Let's keep that in mind. Experience is the final part. And we all have our understanding of experience. It's something that we carry with us, something that has had an effect on us or had an imprint on us. It's the incidents in our me story, the chapters, the episodes. It's kind of, in some ways, it's maybe when you're thinking of the future me story, it's the script for your life. It's the experiences that you're going to have. And in the past. It's the plot of your life to date. I know that I know there's something wrong with my understanding of my me story when I compare what I thought my life was going to be like, the script of what it was supposed to be like and how it has turned out. My life has been completely off script. Right now, at this time in my life, it is utterly off script with every aspect of my life. I mean, I can see the producers in my head, looking at my life right now, I'm submitting new scripts, and they're like, we didn't greenlight this series. This feature film is not the one that we, put into production. It's not even close. Shohaku Okumura has a different translation of experience. We translate this word from the Genjokoan as experience, and his translation of Genjokoan translates experience this way. And I just want to share this quickly. He, instead of saying experience, he says carrying out practice enlightenment. So he wants to, because it's hard to think of an experience without an experiencer, one who has the experience. It's just the way of our language and the way of our understanding to have that difficult to be that way. He kind of, explodes it into something that Dogen is closer to what Dogen probably meant, which he says carrying out practice enlightenment. So his translation of this part of the Genjokoan is conveying oneself towards all things to carry out practice enlightenment is delusion, and all things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. Let's appreciate this relationship that delusion and reason are about the relationship between the self and myriad things. That's what Dogen wants us to appreciate. So what's the relationship between delusion and realization? It's not a dichotomy like inner and outer, or pure and impure, or clear and confused. It's not like that. It's not one state as opposed to another state. Is there actually delusion and realization are inseparable? They're made of the same stuff. You literally can't have one without the other. I mean, you can't have, we can't have day without night. Right? If we didn't have night, we wouldn't have a word for day. It would just be reality. Right? We wouldn't have a word for it. We need night to give it something. But delusion and realization are even, I would say, even more closely intertwined than day and night. The common understanding of Buddhist teachings is that we seek to eliminate delusion or ignorance in order to gain enlightenment, kind of like a poor person can work to make money and get rich. So we can kind of go from one to the other. But in Dogen's understanding, if we think of delusion and realization this way, we're just creating more delusion. Because we're looking at our experience in a goal-oriented way. We're looking at it as the self moving forward, having experiences. And if the self is moving forward, desiring an experience of enlightenment, it's deluded and it's creating suffering. So we want to shift this relationship between the self and myriad things. That's what our practice is pointing us towards doing. And even delusion isn't bad. There's always this, sense within us, yeah, but still. I don't want to be deluded. I don't want to suffer. It kind of gets carried along. But going along with this way of looking at things is like, yeah, we're going to suffer, and yes, we're going to be deluded. And that's part of the deal. In Maezumi Roshi's commentary on the Genjokoan, he actually says, it's quite all right to be deluded. I'm more than willing to be deluded. This is our way. This was a quote in the version of the of Genjokoan, which Sesshin Roshi just shared with me this morning, and that just jumped out at me. But this, of course, doesn't mean that we just want to be deluded all the time. It's like, okay, I'll just be deluded, because then we're just going to be suffering continuously. Okay, and we know we don't want that. We don't want that for ourselves. We don't want that for others. We want to find a way to work with that suffering in order to turn it into the wisdom that Buddhist practice, Zen practice, promises us. Rinzai took this kind of okayness with delusion even further. He said, living in hell is like taking a walk in a beautiful park. I'm not there. I'm not there. I mean, but the degree of, clarity, that's not the right word, It's the degree of being open to the suffering moving through him, not as an experience, but as a coming forth and realizing itself. And when it realizes itself in wisdom. The ability to be that open, then he can live in hell, and that will be paradise. So this relation with delusion and realization, it's also helpful to see that there's kind of layers that are at play within us. It isn't, it's never all or one. It's never that. We have delusion within enlightenment. We have enlightenment within delusion. We have delusion within delusion, and enlightenment within enlightenment, and on and on. And Dogen talks about this in the Genjokoan. Since the self is always making experiences out of things and creating delusion and suffering through that process, it can even make an experience out of the coming forth of myriad things and realizing themselves in the self, which is enlightenment or realization. So we do this all the time. We have periods of selfless activity, periods of real dropping away and connection. And very quickly we tend to include those into our me story. When I was at ZCLA, I did a lot of exploratory drug use in my 20s because I wanted to have these ecstatic experiences. I wanted to have these enlightenment experiences that I had heard about, and I had stopped doing that by my late 20s when I was started practicing ZCLA, and I did talk to Maezumi Roshi about it, and when I asked him about it in Dokusan, he went, "Pah! Oh, LSD. It's this feeling of being unborn." He just looked at it really scornfully, because this was my understanding of what he was saying. That, well, okay, you have this, this feeling of being unborn, and and I'm like, feeling of unborn? Yeah. That's it, isn't it? Like, no, it becomes an experience, and now it's going to create more suffering when it's experienced that way. So carrying the self forward and experiencing myriad things is delusion. This is how we normally operate. Right? We create experiences. We have experiences. We possess them. We create meaning out of our past, and we create expectations for our future. Our me story is full of experiences, full of people and sensations and versions of ourself nested within the story. Our feelings become part of the me story. It's very difficult to see, our lives other than this. It's just really is a natural way of seeing our lives. But there are also these strong indications that that way of being, just from experience to experience to experience, is a bit off. Right? We don't have control, very much. We're not even in control of our thoughts. So to think of ourselves as a character with agency, going through and having these experiences, doesn't really hold water. Because so much of this is just happening. Feelings are happening, our breathing is happening. Even when we look at something like walking or chewing, we've got some aspect of volition that we're kind of initiating that, but we're not in control of all of the micro movements of our jaw, or of our legs, or of our feet. This is just happening. The suffering happens when the me story hits up against reality. Hits up against reality, it isn't confirmed, and then we can't handle the disjunction between our story and then what's really going on. As long as things sort of appear to conform to the story, we don't typically have a edge. We not suffer, but how often does that happen? It's almost as if the universe is perfectly designed to pull the rug out from all of your stories and ideas. Right? So it will come up against reality, and it will be shown to be just a story and just an idea. And how we handle that is going to determine how much suffering we experience. If we have a disturbance around that, difficulty, fear, or a judgment that comes up around this disjunction, then we're going to add another layer of thoughts and control mechanisms, another story on top of the disjunction to make sense of the disjunction. Layers of stories, all trying to correct themselves, all trying to complete the self in some way, all these adaptive, corrective mechanisms. And none of them are going to conform with reality, because reality doesn't unfold according to ideas. And that type of layers of stories, that's what I call neurosis. Story about a problem with a story, about a problem with a story, about a problem with a story. All coming from, seeds of not being okay with the present moment in our understanding. Is everybody here pretty familiar with neurosis?
I have my own.
Is there anybody here who hasn't at some point in their life been quite convinced that they're the most neurotic person in the history of the world? Yeah. Yeah, we're really, really familiar. And it does cause a lot of suffering. It really does. But there's a way to work with this provisional self. We can't just say, okay, self bad, make it go away. I'm going to live in the moment. What happens happens. This kind of attitude. That's not possible either. The self will self like this. It will interpret experiences in this way. So we do have to work with this provisional self. That's a term from Katagiri Roshi, this provisional self. We work with it to practice no self. So how about this coming forth? That myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. Or another translation is all things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. What's the subject of this activity? All beings. Right? It's the myriad things. It's all beings. Bampo. And then this understanding, all beings come forth and experience themselves through us. The weeds experience themselves in your weeding. The paint experiences itself in your painting. You see it as a dynamic functioning of the light of the universe. Always dynamically functioning in all of us. And we bring it alive in our practice. Bring it alive consciously when we don't have this subjective I that's doing it or commenting on it. This dynamic light, this dynamic functioning of this light comes forth. And it seems to me to be the case that when we are functioning in this way, that it truly does affect all beings. It's the being that you're interacting with, and it's the beings in your surroundings. You can experience this, I think, with the way people will interact with you after doing a big retreat or after decades of long practice. After practice, as you apply yourself to practice, you see that your practice is affecting them. And likewise, to spend time with teachers and those who have spent decades practicing, so that they're operating from this dynamic functioning of the light all the time. That shifts your own understanding and experience of yourself. The session is designed to help us to practice this coming forth, allowing myriad things to come forth and experience themselves through you. And I just want to mention a few of what I consider to be the allies within Sesshin to help us practice in this way. The schedule is one of them. Tetsudo mentioned this in his talk a few days ago. Is the fact that we have this schedule means we don't have to think about experiences. We don't have to think about planning it. We don't have to think about any sort of special quality. You can even now notice in your mind, it's like, oh, it's coming up to the afternoon sit and I usually feel this way. Our mind starts to go into strategies and stories about how each sitting might be and what the good ones are and how tired you are, and all these things start to come to play. But the fact is, it's just the schedule. You can see your mind operating in that way and just put yourself into it. No need for any sort of calculation or story. It just doesn't have anything to hold on to. The second ally is the body. The body doesn't really care about your story. I don't think any of us would get cancer or get ill. If he cared about the story. Really doesn't care about the the story. So listen to the body. Listen deeply to the feelings. Listen deeply to what arises. Listen to the sensations. When you're chewing, when you're walking, when you're sitting, of course, zazen. All of these very simple activities, just deep intimacy with your body and what phenomena are arising within it. And the third ally that I think of is a willingness to be naked. It's a continual willingness to be intimate with your experience, to let down your guard, to drop the story, to not get hung up on the commentary and the judgments, to be willing to feel the strong emotions that come up during session. That's the fuel. It's the fuel of your suffering and the fuel of your wisdom. It's the anger, the sadness, the confusion, the shame, the pain. Be naked to all of this. Be naked to all of it. Be naked to the birds flapping out in the pond. Be naked to the clouds. Be naked to each other. Not physically naked, unguarded. It's not a passive coming forth. It's coming forth that we experience, that we're practicing. I just want to mention that. It's not passive. It's very engaged in all of this. Feeling the feelings, weeding the weeding, chewing the food, the tastes, the phenomena, all of it. Nothing passive about it at all. So when one of us allows Banpo, allows myriad things to come forth and experience themselves through us, when you allow it to come forth them, when you allow them to come forth and experience themselves through you, that's the whole world practicing. All beings are practicing in your practice, in your zazen. And remember that Banpo, myriad things, include yourself and myself and other selves. Allow all that to come forth within you. We have this expression, we chant with our ears. When we're doing the service, we chant with our ears, and it strikes me that this is exactly what we mean by that. We chant with our ears is we're hearing, and then we're chanting, and the chanting is coming from what we hear. So the whole room chanting is coming forth within our own practice of chanting. It's experiencing itself through our own chanting if we're really chanting from our ears. That unity, that union, if we really do that, that's realization in this understanding. But we can do this. In this coming forth, all things move forward. It's not that yourself is off separate, observing all things moving forward. Right? Yourself is moving forward too. And I had an experience of this in Dokusan with my Zumi Roshi. I don't remember what the subject of the Dokusan was or what I had brought. I wasn't doing koan practice at the time. This is early in my practice, but what I do remember, and it is imprinted on me, is he just went just like that, and it just struck me like Genshin's finger must have struck some some people who experienced that. It was just in words. If I had to put words to it, I would say something like everything moves together as one. But the words don't quite grasp it. It's still vivid in my mind. And I believe that's what he was communicating to me. All things move together as one in this realization. It's the coming forth of all things within ourselves, experiencing themselves through us, all together, including ourselves. This all, when we apply ourselves in this way, we apply ourselves to universal effort instead of an individual effort. This is the last pointer that I want to share, and I read this from Katagiri Roshi. Again, he talks about this dynamic functioning of the light, and he says it's do your activities, do your practice with universal effort first, then individual effort. So the universal effort is all beings contributing to what you're doing, all beings sitting zazen with you, all beings weeding, all beings chewing, all beings cleaning the toilet, everyone. That's universal effort. And then there's the individual effort, which is you doing it with your degree of proficiency or commentary or whatever might be there. But before that, what's fueling the individual effort is actually the universal effort of all beings doing it. And if we do this without a thought of delusion or realization, right? All right, I'm going to use universal effort so I can become realized. No. Let's avoid that. Yeah, let's just go right to universal effort and have all things. Wash your face, brush your teeth, do your zazen. Then, we're all practicing together in the highest way, in the strongest way, in the most intense way. It really brings us all together in this session very strongly. Help us to rebalance this kind of imbalance we have between the self-experiencing mode and this coming forth mode. We just want to get better. Want to get better at this allowing, coming forth. As we get better, then this whole suffering, wisdom mess that we have going, it's going to be more flowing. It's going to be fuller. It's going to be richer, and there's going to be less suffering, which is what we all want. So thank you for your strong practice, and thank you for being in the mud altogether.